The destruction of David Vance's life didn't begin with an argument, a confession, or a sudden tragedy. It began with the clinical, rhythmic snapping of leather heels against the marble floor of St. Jude's Church. It was June 14th, a suffocatingly hot Saturday afternoon, and 80 guests sat in absolute silence, waiting for the vows to begin. David stood at the altar, his chest rising and falling with the nervous adrenaline of a man who believed he had finally secured his future. Next to him stood Clara Finch, a vision in delicate white lace. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that looked exactly like absolute devotion. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary swung shut with a muted, definitive thud. Eleanor Vance, David's 61-year-old mother, didn't look like a frantic woman staging an emotional scene. She moved down the center aisle with a cold, terrifying precision that instantly paralyzed the room. She wasn't wearing the soft pastel dress she had bought for the occasion. Instead, she wore a dark, severe wool trench coat that looked completely out of place in the summer heat. The priest stopped mid-sentence, his book hovering in the air. David took a step forward, a heavy knot of embarrassment twisting in his gut as he whispered fiercely for his mother to sit down. But Eleanor didn't look at her son. Her eyes were fixed entirely on the bride. Without saying a single word to her son or the priest, Eleanor reached into her heavy coat, pulled out a faded, stained manila envelope, and dropped it onto the wooden altar rail. The dull thud of the paper hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot in the silent church. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't look at the confused, whispering faces of the guests. She simply looked Clara dead in the eyes and delivered 7 words that instantly turned a celebration into a psychological crime scene. "Eleanor, tell him what happened in Blackwood Lake." Within seconds, the veneer of the perfect wedding shattered. Clara didn't cry. She didn't scream, demand an apology, or look to David for protection. Instead, every ounce of color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost in her own bridal gown. Her grip on David's hand went completely limp. David looked from his mother's frozen, unforgiving face to his bride's hollow expression, a sudden, sickening realization dawning on him. Clara knew exactly what those words meant. 10 minutes later, the pews were empty, the flowers were left to wilt in the heat, and a 23-year-old secret had just been dragged out of a forgotten grave. Eleanor hadn't just stopped a wedding. She had exposed a decades-long, meticulously planned deception that was about to pull the entire community into a dark investigation. As the guests fled and the church fell silent, David stood alone between the 2 women who defined his life, staring at an old envelope that held the power to rewrite everything he believed to be true about his past, his father, and the woman he had promised to love forever. To fully understand why those 7 words completely dismantled David's world, you have to understand the clean, unblemished framework of the family Eleanor Vance had spent her entire life protecting. In the quiet, blue-collar town of Oak Ridge, Ohio, Eleanor was viewed as a living monument to resilient motherhood. She was a stoic, deeply respected widow who had raised David entirely on her own since the autumn of 2003. That was the year her husband, Thomas Vance, completely vanished from the face of the earth. At the time, the local police department conducted a superficial investigation and concluded that Thomas, drowning in massive, unpayable gambling debts, had simply packed a single duffel bag, abandoned his wife and young son, and hopped a Greyhound bus out of state to escape his obligations. Eleanor never publicly wept. She never begged for him to come home on the evening news. Instead, she took a grueling second job at the county records office, worked late into the night, and systematically paid off every single cent her husband owed to local lenders. She ensured David grew up in a stable, quiet home, completely shielded from the stigma of his father's cowardice. Years later, when David brought Clara Finch home to meet his mother, Eleanor seemed to finally find peace. Clara was a medical illustrator, quiet, deeply analytical, and highly reserved. She wasn't an Oak Ridge native. She had moved to the town 6 years prior from a small community out east, claiming she wanted a fresh start away from the painful memories of her own father's untimely death from a heart attack. For 4 years, Clara integrated herself perfectly into the fabric of the Vance family. She spent her weekends helping Eleanor tend to her garden. She cooked Sunday dinners, and she listened intently to Eleanor's stories about the town's history. But as the wedding date drew closer, an invisible tension began to warp the household. The turning point didn't happen because of a slip of the tongue. It happened because Eleanor Vance was a woman obsessed with verification. Working for over 2 decades in the county records office, Eleanor understood a fundamental truth about human nature. People can lie, but paper always remembers. 6 months before the wedding, when Clara finalized her marriage license paperwork, she had to submit her birth certificate and her mother's death records to the county clerk. Because it was her son's wedding, Eleanor handled the filing herself. It was supposed to be a routine administrative task. But as Eleanor's eyes scanned the death certificate of Clara's mother, Sarah Finch, she noticed a detail that made her blood run cold. The notary stamp on Sarah's 2018 death certificate matched the exact rural jurisdiction of Blackwood Lake, the very town Eleanor's late husband had frequented right before he vanished in 2003. Driven by a sudden, suffocating suspicion, Eleanor didn't go home that night. Instead, she stayed hours after the building closed, taking a lantern down into the dead storage basement where the state's archived microfiche from the early 2000s was kept. She began pulling old microfiche reels for Blackwood Lake from November 2003. For hours, the only sound in the basement was the mechanical click of the film projector. And then she found it, a tiny, 3-line obituary in a forgotten regional newspaper for a Thomas Vance who had tragically drowned in an accidental boating mishap. Eleanor sat frozen in the dark. The local police had told her for 23 years that her husband had hopped a bus to escape gambling debts. Yet here, in an archive 40 miles away, was a legal document stating he was dead. But the true horror, the realization that turned Eleanor's suspicion into absolute certainty, came when she pulled the corresponding life insurance payout ledger. The $250,000 policy had been fast-tracked and paid out directly to Sarah Finch. Eleanor realized in that dark basement that she wasn't just looking at an old affair. She was looking at a massive, systemic fraud. And worse, she realized that Clara Finch's sudden appearance in her son's life 6 years ago wasn't a coincidence. Clara had spent years tracking down the family her mother had helped defraud. Eleanor didn't confront David immediately because she knew her son was deeply in love. He would have accused her of being a jealous, unhinged mother trying to sabotage his happiness. She needed undeniable proof that Clara wasn't an innocent bystander, but an active participant in the lie. So Eleanor waited. She watched Clara at Sunday dinners, noting the subtle panic in the girl's eyes whenever the past was mentioned. She spent months quietly gathering certified copies of the fraudulent records, building her case like a prosecutor, waiting for the one moment where Clara would be completely exposed, unable to lie her way out. She let the wedding planning continue, watching the invitations go out, watching her son beam with pride, all while holding a psychological detonator in her hands. She chose the altar not out of cruelty to David, but because it was the one place where Clara would be completely trapped under the eyes of God, the community, and the law. And when she finally dropped that envelope, the war for the truth truly began. By Sunday morning, the town of Oak Ridge was buzzing with a singular, venomous assumption. Eleanor Vance had finally lost her mind. The public narrative circulating through the town's coffee shops and text threads was simple, reactive, and cruel. Neighbors assumed a bitter, overprotective widow had staged a malicious psychological breakdown at the altar, manufacturing a fake crisis to prevent her only son from finally leaving her nest. David himself sat in his mother's living room, his chest burning with a toxic mixture of intense humiliation and fury. He had spent the entire night parked in his car, refusing to answer Clara's frantic, essay-length text messages, and he had come to his mother's house with one absolute objective: to tell her he was cutting her out of his life permanently. But Eleanor didn't flinch under her son's white-hot anger. With a calm, terrifying stillness that stopped him dead in his tracks, she pushed the yellow manila envelope across the polished wood of the coffee table. "Eleanor, you think I ruined your life yesterday? David, open it. Read the names stamped on those state documents, and then you tell me who the real monster is in this town." With trembling hands, David tore open the seal, pulling the brittle contents out onto the table. Document type, date, listed individuals. Key revelation. Missing persons report October 2003. Thomas Vance. Filed exactly 3 weeks before his alleged disappearance. Life insurance policy November 2003. Thomas Vance, Sarah Finch. A $250,000 payout issued to Clara's biological mother. Death certificate January 2004. Thomas Vance. Cause of death listed as accidental drowning in Blackwood Lake. David stared at the paperwork, his mind completely rejecting the syntax of the official text before his eyes. His father hadn't run away to escape gambling debts in 2003. According to the State Insurance Fraud Archives, Thomas Vance had been declared legally dead by accidental drowning in Blackwood Lake just 3 months after he vanished from Oak Ridge. And the sole beneficiary who collected the $250,000 payout wasn't Eleanor. It was Sarah Finch, Clara's biological mother. The room felt entirely devoid of oxygen. The narrative David had built his entire identity around for 23 years was completely inverted. His father hadn't just abandoned them. He had been leading an entirely separate, secret life with another woman in a county 40 miles away. But Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. Eleanor, the insurance company paid out that money because Sarah Finch identified his bloated body in the lake. But look at the dates, David. Clara didn't move to this town by accident 6 years ago. She found you. She targeted you. She wanted to make sure that whatever her mother and your father did in that lake stayed buried forever. I didn't destroy your wedding, son. I pulled you out of a spider's web. David's head throbbed as the psychological horror of his situation expanded. He looked at the paperwork, then looked at his mother's cold, triumphant face. He realized he was caught between two terrifying forces: a mother whose protectiveness felt like a visual execution, and a bride whose love might have been a calculated tactical deployment. He couldn't trust his mother's biases, and he couldn't trust his own shattered memory. He needed an objective, clinical lens to decipher this nightmare. Leaving the papers scattered on the coffee table, David snatched the certified records, stormed out of the house, and drove straight to the one place where emotions were stripped from the facts. He drove to the county sheriff's department, desperately seeking a badge to confirm that his mother was lying. But he had no idea that by walking through those station doors and handing those papers to the detective on duty, he wasn't just verifying his family's past. He was initiating a modern criminal investigation that would systematically peel back the terrifying, forensic layers of Clara's deception. The emotional warfare between David, his mother, and his missing bride quickly spilled out of the living room and into the hands of the law. Unable to carry the crushing weight of the discovery alone, David brought the contents of the envelope to Detective Marcus Vance, a veteran investigator with the county sheriff's department. Detective Vance was a cynical man who dealt strictly in cold, verifiable forensics, not family drama. He had seen hundreds of bitter parents try to sabotage their children's relationships, but as he began to review the original, faded 2003 drowning file from the Blackwood Lake jurisdiction, a series of disturbing, professional red flags immediately began to surface. The 2003 investigation had been handled with extreme, almost criminal negligence by a small, understaffed rural precinct. The body recovered from the murky depths of Blackwood Lake had been in the water for nearly 4 days. It was severely decomposed, bloated, and virtually unrecognizable. In 2003, DNA profiling wasn't automatically mandated for standard non-homicide cases in small, low-budget counties. The local medical examiner had closed the case as a tragic accident based entirely on Sarah Finch's visual identification. She had claimed with absolute certainty that the body was Thomas Vance, pointing to a silver wedding band found on the left hand and a distinct surgical scar on the right shoulder as definitive proof. But as Detective Vance cross-referenced Thomas' old medical records from Oak Ridge, he made a chilling discovery that flipped the entire case on its head. Thomas Vance had never undergone a shoulder surgery in his entire life. The man who drowned in Blackwood Lake 23 years ago wasn't David's father. It was someone else entirely. A nameless John Doe whose identity had been callously stolen to execute a massive, fraudulent payout. The investigation took an even darker turn when Detective Vance secured a federal warrant to audit Clara Finch's modern financial accounts. If Clara was completely oblivious to her deceased mother's past crimes, her personal finances should have been pristine and uncomplicated. Instead, the bank records revealed a highly disciplined, terrifying pattern. Every single month for the last 4 consecutive years, Clara had been transferring exactly $800 to an offshore, untraceable digital account registered in Panama. The account had been opened using a forged social security number, but the listed power of attorney was an individual operating under the alias T. Vance. The realization hit the detective with absolute, undeniable clarity. Thomas Vance wasn't a ghost, and he wasn't dead. He was alive, hiding in plain sight overseas, and his own daughter was actively funding his survival. Armed with this forensic evidence, Detective Vance knew this was no longer a cold case of insurance fraud. It was an ongoing, active conspiracy. He set a trap, laying out the financial data for David to see, forcing the young man to confront the woman he loved with the mathematical proof of her betrayal. The interior of an isolated diner off Route 6 late at night, surrounded by heavy, blinding rainfall. The camera focuses on a wide shot of David and Clara sitting across from each other in a cracked, dark vinyl booth. The harsh overhead fluorescent light exposes every line of exhaustion and defeat on Clara's face, casting deep shadows under her eyes. The final confrontation didn't happen with a dramatic police raid, flashing blue lights, or a screaming match in the middle of the street. It took place at 2 a.m. inside a washed-out, fluorescent-lit diner off Route 6, 30 miles outside of town. The rain was drumming violently against the glass windows, blurring the outside world into streaks of black and gray, as David sat in a booth, staring at the woman he had loved completely for 4 years. Clara sat across from him, stripped entirely of her bridal elegance. She wore a plain, oversized gray sweatshirt, her hair pulled back tightly in a messy knot, her face pale and entirely hollowed out by the inevitable collapse of her double life. David didn't say a word at first. He quietly slid the forensic bank audits and the copies of the Panama wire transfers across the sticky table, letting them rest right between them. He didn't raise his voice. His tone was flat, exhausted, and completely broken. "David, how long have you known that he was alive?" Clara looked down at the highlighted financial records, her eyes tracing the numbers she had spent years trying to hide. She didn't offer a defense, nor did she try to invent another lie. The psychological burden she had been carrying for over a decade seemed to finally snap under the weight of his question, as if a part of her was relieved the truth had finally caught up. "Clara, I found out when I was 16, she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. "My mother was dying of cancer in a hospice care ward, and she confessed everything to me on her deathbed. She didn't murder your father, David. Thomas was desperate. He owed thousands of dollars to violent people who were going to kill him. He was the one who found a deceased homeless man near the rail yards, dressed him in his own clothes, and dragged him into the lake. My mother just did what she had to do to survive, collect the policy, and clear his name. David, then why did you come to Oak Ridge? Why did you find me? Was any of it real?" Clara finally looked up, tears welling in her eyes, reflecting the cold, unyielding light of the diner. "Clara, because 4 years ago he tracked me down. He ran out of money in Panama. He threatened to go to the federal prosecutors and confess to the fraud, which would have stripped my mother's estate, taken everything I owned, and sent me to prison as an accessory after the fact. He extorted me, David. I came to Oak Ridge originally just to look at the family he abandoned. I wanted to see if you were as damaged as I was. I never planned to fall in love with you. But the closer we got, the more I realized that the only way to keep you safe from the truth was to control the narrative myself." Clara had engineered the relationship as a desperate shield, believing that if she married David and eventually moved him out of state, she could quietly pay off her father's blackmail until the old man finally died in exile. She thought she could build a sanctuary on top of a graveyard. But as David stared at her, he realized that every kiss, every shared dream, and every plan for the future had been built on a foundation of shifting sand. The woman he loved was an illusion, and the trap his mother had sprung at the altar was officially closing around them both, transitioning them from a broken romance into the cold, unyielding hands of a federal indictment. Calculated crimes, no matter how meticulously plotted or safely buried by the passage of decades, never truly end with a clean resolution. Instead, they act like a slow poison, leaching into the soil of everyone's life until the foundation itself crumbles. When a 23-year-old lie finally collapses, it doesn't just destroy the guilty. It leaves the innocent standing in a wasteland of permanent, irreversible damage. 3 weeks after the wedding at St. Jude's Church was violently brought to a halt, the legal machinery began to grind. Armed with the forensic wire transfer data uncovered by Detective Vance, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, cooperating with international authorities, tracked down a 66-year-old man living in a secluded, sun-baked coastal village in central Panama. He was living under the name Arthur Pendleton, operating a small, quiet boat rental shop. When the federal agents approached him on the dock, Thomas Vance didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply dropped his clipboard, held out his wrists for the handcuffs, and took a deep, long breath. He looked remarkably ordinary, just a frail, weathered old man with gray hair and calloused hands. The extradition back to Ohio was quiet, but the media coverage was relentless. In his federal mugshot, Thomas stared directly into the lens with a cold, glassy detachment. To him, the family he had left behind in 2003 was just a distant memory, a necessary casualty of his own survival. During his brief trial, the courtroom learned the full extent of his apathy. He had spent 23 years living comfortably off the suffering of 2 separate families, entirely unbothered by the fact that his wife had worked 2 jobs to pay his debts, or that his daughter had ruined her own youth to pay his hush money. Thomas was sentenced to 12 years in a federal correctional facility for conspiracy, insurance fraud, and identity theft, a sentence that, given his age and failing health, was effectively a life term. He went to prison without ever asking to see his son, and without ever offering an apology to the woman he left behind. For Clara Finch, the legal outcome was far more lenient, but the societal execution was absolute. Because she cooperated fully with the federal prosecutors, providing every bank statement, routing number, and email exchange that linked her father to the extortion scheme, the Department of Justice granted her full immunity from prosecution as an accessory after the fact. She avoided a prison cell, but she could not avoid the devastating fallout of her choices. Her professional career as a medical illustrator vanished overnight. No university or medical journal wanted their name associated with a high-profile federal identity theft scandal. The relationship she had spent 4 years building with David was not just dead. It was radioactive. The morning after her final meeting with David at the diner, Clara returned to their shared apartment while he was away, packed her life into the back of a small rental truck, and drove out of Oak Ridge. She didn't leave a note. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply disappeared into the vast obscurity of the Pacific Northwest, changing her phone number and shutting down every trace of her digital existence. She survived the collapse, but she survived it as a ghost, haunted by the reality that the man she genuinely loved would only ever remember her as a brilliant, calculating liar. But the most severe, unyielding sentence was handed down to those who remained in the quiet, judgmental streets of Oak Ridge. Eleanor Vance had achieved exactly what she set out to do on that blistering June afternoon. She had successfully exposed the fraud. She had protected her son from marrying into a lineage of deception, and she had definitively proven to the entire community that her missing husband was a criminal, completely validating her 23 years of silent, agonizing labor. But her triumph was entirely destitute. The weaponized, public manner in which Eleanor chose to reveal the truth, shattering her son's dignity at the altar instead of pulling him aside in private, revealed a dark, possessive trait that David could not forgive. Eleanor had prioritized her own vindication over her son's emotional safety. 2 weeks after the canceled wedding, David packed his bags, resigned from his teaching position at the local high school, and left the town of Oak Ridge permanently. He moved 3 states away, took a low-profile job under a quiet administration, and cut off all communication with his mother. He changed his number, ignored her letters, and left her alone in the massive, silent house on the edge of the county line. Eleanor Vance now sits alone at her dining room table every single night. The house is perfectly clean, the garden is meticulously tended, and the townspeople treat her with a quiet, distant respect. But the telephone on her wall never rings. She won the war against her husband's memory, but the cost of her victory was the only person she had spent her life trying to save. Every hidden truth eventually forces its way through the dirt and into the light, but it never arrives with mercy. It tears through the innocent and the guilty alike, leaving behind a cold, permanent landscape of regret. As the autumn wind blows through the empty courtyard of St. Jude's Church, the wilted flowers are long gone, and the heavy oak doors remain shut. The sanctuary stands as a grim, silent monument to a 23-year-old secret that was kept far too long, leaving a broken family to spend the rest of their quiet lives wondering, what did saving the truth really cost them? Some truths are heavier than lies. Calculated crimes, no matter how meticulously plotted or safely buried by the passage of decades, never truly end with a clean resolution. Instead, they act like a slow poison, leaching into the soil of everyone's life until the foundation itself crumbles. When a 23-year-old lie finally collapses, it doesn't just destroy the guilty. It leaves the innocent standing in a wasteland of permanent, irreversible damage. And as we've seen today, a single calculated secret can ripple out across decades to destroy completely innocent lives. If the dark journey of the Vance and Finch families kept you pinned to your seat, please take a brief moment to hit that like button. Your support heavily helps the algorithm bring these high-production, deeply clinical true crime documentaries to light. Don't step out of the dark just yet. If you haven't already, make sure to click subscribe and join our community of deep divers. 2 more unmissable, highly intense investigations are appearing on your screen right now. Click on the video to your left to dive into another case of long-term psychological manipulation exposed, or choose the video on your right to watch an investigation where the truth arrived far too late. Thank you for listening and stay vigilant out there.